Chapter 1 Fundamental Concepts of Descriptive Psychopathology. Keywords that will be discussed in this chapter: Descriptive Psychopathology, Phenomenology, Norms, Subjectivity. Descriptive Psychopathology. It can be said that descriptive psychopathology is the fundamental professional skill of the psychiatrist and is possibly the only diagnostic skill unique to him. It is the precise description, categorization, and definition of abnormal experiences as recounted by the patient and observed in their behavior. It simply describes, thereby avoiding arguments about causation. Hence, it guards against and avoids theory, presupposition, and prejudice. It is concerned with selection, delimitation, differentiation, and description of particular phenomena of experience, which, through the use of accepted terminology, becomes both defined and capable of repeated identification. As shown in this flowchart, the study of psychopathology is mainly divided into two parts, which are explanatory and descriptive. The explanatory psychopathology is further divided into psychodynamic, behavioral, etc., while descriptive psychopathology is divided into observation and phenomenology. What is psychopathology? Psychopathology is the systematic study of abnormal experience, cognition, and behavior, that is, the study of the products of a disordered mind. It is important to distinguish psychopathology from nosography, which is the description of single illness with provisional and characteristic features that lay the foundation for diagnosis. Explanatory psychopathology, on the other hand, often assumes that mental phenomena are meaningful. In psychoanalysis, for example, explanations are based on the underlying theoretical processes such as transference or ego defense mechanisms. And dynamic psychopathology aims to describe how the delusion arose, its psychological origins, and why it should be that particular delusion on the evidence of that person's experiences in early life. This table summarizes and differentiates descriptive and psychoanalytic psychopathologies. There are also other radically different models of psychology that regards mental experiences, including thoughts, moods, and drives, as epiphenomena, that is, as no more than froth on top of the beer. They state that mental life is illusory, and it is only the material and organic processes that are real. Barrios has described two formulations of descriptive psychopathology. First is the continuity view. In this, psychologists predominantly tended to regard morbid phenomena as quantitative variations on normal mental functions. The second is the discontinuity view. In this, the psychiatrists, who were also known as alienists, working directly with the mentally ill patients, considered that some symptoms were too bizarre to have a counterpart in normal behavior. Phenomenology and psychopathology. Phenomenology is an inquiry into one's conscious and intellectual processes, eschewing any preconceptions about external causes. It aims to focus on experienced phenomena to establish their universal character. It involves the elicitation and description of abnormal psychological events, the internal experience of the patient, and their consequent behavior. It demands a very precise description of exactly how the patient feels inside, and diagnosis should be made on a sound psychopathological basis. Studying phenomena with diagnostic tools sharpens clinical acumen and improves communication with the patient. Jaspers wrote, "Phenomenology, though one of the foundation stones of psychopathology, is still very crude. One of the great problems in using this method is the muddled nature of terminology. Almost identical ideas may be assigned different names by people from different theoretical backgrounds." Barrios has described four meanings to phenomenology. P1 refers to its commonest clinical usage as a mere synonym for signs and symptoms. As in phenomenological psychopathology, this is a bastardized use and hence conceptually uninteresting. P2 refers to a pseudo-technical sense often used in dictionaries, and this approach is misleading in that it suggests false evolutionary lines and begs important questions relating to history of phenomenology. P3 refers to the idiosyncratic usage started by Carl Jaspers, whose description of mental states was empathetic and theoretically neutral. And finally, P4 refers to the complex philosophical system started by Edmund Husserl and continued by writers collectively named the Phenomenological movement. This book concentrates entirely on the Jaspersian meaning of phenomenology. Now let's discuss some concepts. Disease and illness. A simple dictum is to regard disease as what the doctors treat and the illness as what the person suffers from. Sass argued that psychiatric or mental diseases do not exist, as mental is an abstract concept, and that only behavioral deviances and moral or social judgments are at play in psychiatry, and thus he uses the term myth to characterize mental diseases. Scarding and Kendall use the combination of statistical deviance and biological disadvantage to determine what is disease. Bors add that a disease is any condition that interferes with any function of an organism. A disease becomes an illness when it is deemed undesirable, a title for special treatment, and a valid excuse for particular behaviors. Norms, normal and abnormal. The word normal is used correctly in at least 4 senses in the English language. These are value norm, statistical norm, the individual norm, and the typological norm. The value norm takes the ideal as its concept of normality. In the statistical norm, the abnormal is considered to be that which falls outside the average range. The individual norm is the consistent level of functioning that an individual maintains over time. And typological abnormality describes the situation in which a condition is regarded as normal in all the 3 meanings and yet represents abnormality. In addition, there is also social norms, which determines in specific cultures what behaviors are acceptable and approved of. Understanding and ununderstandable. Understanding the patient's story, grasping the inner logic of the narrative, and representing to oneself the patient's subjective experience is very important. The patient is also helped to have confidence in the doctor because they realize that their symptoms are understood and therefore accepted as real. For this, the doctor must have a detailed knowledge of patient's background culture and specific information about their family and immediate environment. Start with the premise that the behavior means something, that is, it arises with internal consistency from psychological events. Jaspers contrasted understanding, that is Verstehen, with explaining, that is Erklären. He has shown how these terms may be used in both a static and a genetic sense. Static implies understanding or explaining the present situation from information that is available now, while the genetic sense considers how the situation reached its present state by examining antecedents, the evolving processes, and emerging situations. Explanation is concerned with accounting for events from a point of observation outside them and understanding from inside them. A good example being one understands another person's anger and its consequences, while one explains the occurrence of snow in winter. Although one can empathize with the contents of patient's delusions and thereby understand how that content of the belief originated, the occurrence of the delusion itself is usually ununderstandable, that is, why they should believe something that is demonstrably false. This table summarizes the static and genetic sense of understanding and explanation. Empathy. This is a very important psychiatric concept that literally means feeling oneself into and should be distinguished from sympathy, which is feeling with. A way to appreciate the distinction between empathy and sympathy is to recognize the role of an objective stance towards the patient coupled with an active attempt to fully understand how certain thoughts arise from particular moods, wishes or fears, and the nexus of connections between different aspects of the patient's experience is integral to empathy. It is achieved by precise, insightful, persistent and knowledgeable questioning until the doctor is able to give an account of the patient's subjective experience that the patient recognizes as his own. Success depends on the capacity of the doctor as a human being to experience something like the internal experience of the patient. It is not an assessment that could be carried out by a microphone or computer. And when empathy fails to render a patient's subjective experience understandable, we can then talk about the experience as being ununderstandable. In addition to empathy, accurate observation of behavior is another component of descriptive psychopathology, such as meaningful gestures, behavior, physical appearance, facial expressions, interpersonal stance, attitude, clothing, makeup, and so on. But empathy can be a problematic concept. Various potentially contradictory interpretations are possible, including transferring oneself into another person's mind, sharing the patient's experience, or actualizing the patient's experience for oneself. The use of empathy to work out phenomenology in psychiatry is an extension of the history in that it amplifies the description of the patient's complaints. The clinician must use human characteristics he holds in common with the patient, like the fact that he inhabits the same world of meanings, that they communicate in a common language, and that, like them, he has a rich inner life. So to summarize, the purpose of phenomenological method is to describe inner experiences, order and classify them, and create a reliable terminology. Form and content. Form refers to those impersonal aspects of the mental symptoms that guarantee its stability in time and space. That is, its constancy elements, while content is the subjective coloring of the experience. Form must be kept distinct from content, which may change from time to time but are inextricably woven together. Form might be the sense modality in which a perception is presented to us, for example, auditory hallucinations, or the cognitive domain, for example, delusions, in which a particular aspect of psychic life is experienced or enacted. While psychiatrist is busy clarifying the form, which is usually the diagnostic key to mental illness, the content is usually all important to the patient. Primary and secondary phenomena. Psychic events emerge out of one another in a way that can be understood, the so-called meaningful connections. The conceptual distinction of primary and secondary phenomena may be determined by the causal chain. Primary is the proximate cause, whereas what is secondary is the discernible distant effect. Primary is immediate and ultimate, and therefore cannot be further reduced by understanding. Subjectivity and objectivity in psychopathology. The process of making a scientific evaluation consists of various stages. This is a progressive process of selecting and discarding information, which is mostly a subjective judgment. Therefore, there is no such thing as an unprejudiced observation. Objective assessments are necessarily subjectively value-laden in what the observer chooses to measure. Therefore, as can be expected, psychiatric evaluation is also a mixture of these two. Objective assessments include the measurement of body movements, patient's handwriting, learning capacity, memory span, work efficiency, etc. While subjective analysis can be made, for example, for facial expression. When a doctor says they look sad, he is not measuring the patient's facial expression in units of sadness by some objective yardstick. Rapport is the emotional quality of the relationship that the patient establishes with the doctor during the clinical encounter. This is necessarily a subjective experience for the doctor, but that is not to say that it is unreal or even that it cannot be measured. Unconscious experience and phenomenology. Descriptive psychopathology has no theory of the unconscious, nor does it deny its existence. Dreams, the contents of hypnotic trance, and slips of tongue are described according to how they manifest in consciousness. Organic and neural substrates of psychopathology. It is not to imply that underlying neural mechanisms are unimportant. But usefulness of psychopathology is not dependent on ultimately finding the localization in the brain of a delusion or any other psychic event. Even when the organic cause of the condition is known, psychopathology remains involved in describing, defining, and ordering the actual subjective experience of the patient. Early on, organically oriented psychiatrists such as Griesinger and Wernicke were not concerned with the psychopathological in psychiatry, but much more with the charting of the diseased brain. This paid a rich dividend, for example, in elucidating the nature and treatment of cerebral syphilis. Mind-brain duality and psychopathology. Cartesian duality is the view that mind and body are separate substances, expounded by René Descartes, in which he made a distinction between the material world and the thinking human mind. But there are a number of significant problems with Cartesian dualism. For example, how an immaterial substance like the mind can influence a material substance like the body. Is it possible or plausible to reduce mental events to physical events in the brain? Phenomenology avoids this debate entirely by leaving it to one side while continuing to explore, investigate, describe, define, and catalogue the mental events as reported by the patient.